Good afternoon. Welcome to Constitution Days 2012, Laney College. We have a few speakers scheduled for today. There it is. In case you missed it, I wanted to introduce Senator Anthony Elias. We're in Poli-Sci 32 at College of Alameda, the leadership and organization class. Anybody that's interested in student government or any kind of organizing, I'd highly recommend the class. It's all hands-on. We helped organize this event. It's a two-day event, today at noon and also tomorrow. Today, I would like to introduce Evelyn Lord, Vice President of the Faculty Senate. She has a few words to start the day. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Constitution Day at Laney College. My name is Evelyn Lord, and I'm the Vice President of the Faculty Senate. And I'm here with Denise Richardson, who is Political Science faculty and also the President of the Laney Faculty Senate. She has laryngitis today, so she doesn't have her voice, and she asked me to be her voice today, and I'm happy to do that. So I'm going to read the words that she has written for me to share with you. And I think there's something about this voice that I think is really appropriate on Constitution Day in an election year, because this is all about using our voices. On behalf of the Faculty Senate and the Department of Social Sciences, I welcome you to the 225th anniversary recognition of the United States Constitution. Special thanks to our college president, Dr. Elnora Webb, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I'd also like to thank Mark Wilson, the student who just introduced us, who has worked tirelessly along with the support of the ASLC to organize today's and tomorrow's events. Among many other things, the Constitution is our promise that our government is here to serve us. We live in a democracy that depends upon our participation in order to function as it should. On Tuesday, November 6th, you will have an opportunity to use your democratic power, your voice, in one of the most defining and critical periods of our history. If you aren't already registered to vote, please do so today. We have tables over there set up by the associated students, and they're there to help you register to vote. It's free. It just takes a couple minutes. Everybody should go do it. Go register to vote at the table with the green tablecloth. Please take advantage of this powerful opportunity to participate in making government work for us. Thank you. Thank you, Denise, for writing those powerful words. And now I'd like to introduce our President of Laney College, Dr. Elnora Webb. Let's give her a hand.
Thank you, Anthony. Anthony and Mark have done a wonderful job in convening us. It's my honor to stand before you. You, as students of Laney College, faculty, classified staff, administrators, visitors on this campus, each one of us, without exception, has a civic responsibility for one another. Part of the reason why we have higher education is due to the nature of our Constitution. I'd like for all of us to hear a few words that's going to be shared by one of our faculty members here at Laney, who also works at Berkeley City College. Before that, I'd like to just echo the sentiments of our Faculty Senate President and Vice President by saying the responsibility is ours to vote. Why is Constitution Day important? It's an important day to remember that we created an infrastructure in this that ensured the creation of this country. Not you and I, literally. 39 men came together, even with their biases and their elitism. They came together and said, let's form something that's greater than what we've experienced before. Let's unite these desperate states under one constitution. Let's create 3 major branches of government: the legislative branch, Congress, Senate, House of Representatives; the executive branch, the office of the president, and all the leadership, including the vice president, that's part of that executive team. Let's create what we call the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. And together, those 3 branches ensures that we have something that we call a civil environment, a way to merge these various states under one governance. And through our vote, through our active participation as informed, intelligent individuals, we can create an environment that serves the greater good, and not just an elite group of individuals, including those who formed these United States. In hindsight, they were geniuses, if you will. They were looking for a way to provide access to all of us to something greater than what we would otherwise experience. And even though some of them were clearly biased, they still had slaves. They didn't provide access to all of their resources to those in their community. They were thinking about something that was far beyond them. And through them came something that was remarkable: the Constitution of these United States. And the only way that we can ensure that this Constitution is profound is through our active engagement. Our active engagement. How many of you, I want you to raise your hand, knows that in the last 3 years, California has said no to 300 students who tried to access community colleges? How many of you know that? We had 2.9 million students attending California community colleges in the state of California in fall 2009. We now have less than 2.6 million. That's a travesty. And the only way for us to address that is through our collective engagement. What does that mean? It means deciding what we need that will be codified in law. Deciding what we need that will result in funding, policies that leads to funding of education overall. That means doing something like the governor's tax initiative that's going to come up in November for our vote, which we can decide to support or not support, or disconnect altogether. If we all chose as citizens, as voters in this state of California to support Proposition 30, for example, we will ensure that funding will not be further cut from K through 12, from community colleges, from California State Universities, from the University of California. That's what engagement looks like. That's why Constitution Day, as one example, is so critical to remember. We formed something that was for the greater good. We formed something for the greater good. Those 39 men came together and they created something that was quite remarkable. And that's to be honored. And the only way to honor that is through our engagement. So without further ado, I want to thank you for listening, but more importantly, I want to thank you for engaging. And engaging, what do I mean by that? By signing up to be a registered voter, by voting, by reading the different options available and not just checking a box, but actively understanding what's before us and choosing deliberately to make a difference. When we see homeless in the street, when we see fellow students on campus, when we see faculty members running to their cars to go into the next institution they're trying to serve because they're freeway flyers trying to serve the greater good, when we see administrators working very earnestly, when we see classified staff on this campus cleaning the grounds, answering questions. We have to remember that all of us matters, all of us without exception. And when all of us vote and engage in civic responsible ways, we do make a difference, and we will make a more profound difference. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Mark to come back up and introduce this faculty member who is serving us well as an instructor of history, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to share with all of us. Without further ado, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. Thank you very much. Can we hear for Dr. Webb? Our next speaker is Professor Chris Weidenbach. He'll be speaking on today's theme, Promoting the General Welfare. Let's give a big hand to Professor Weidenbach.
My fellow Americans. I had to say it. Good afternoon. I'd like to read the brief, very brief, one-sentence preamble to the United States Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. Let me hit that one again. In order to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. The Constitution is not just a document. Think about I'm an English teacher, so I get down on words. What do words actually mean? Are we using them properly? Are we saying what we think we're saying, right? To constitute something means to make it. Constitution means the making of the United States of America. It is bringing it into existence. It's making it an official something, an official nation state, an official organized community of some kind. It's really a lot stranger than it seems when we hear about it as a document only. I would like to put emphasis on the word welfare because in our time and in my entire conscious lifetime, the word welfare has had a lot of negative ideas and feelings attached to it. It's practically used as a dirty word. But look at the company it keeps. Tranquility, justice, the common defense, the blessings of liberty. That's a nice neighborhood for words, isn't it? So welfare lives in a nice neighborhood. Welfare is a very positive concept. It means simply the well-being of human beings. Well-being, health, happiness. This is not a dirty word. These aren't dirty words. This is right where we want to be. We want to be in a state of welfare. Absolutely. That's the whole idea of an organized government society, an organized self-governing society. I'd like to bring our consciousness to some of the things that we collectively pay for so that we can collectively share them as part of welfare, tranquility, justice, and the blessings of liberty. Our public education system is not called for explicitly in the Constitution. In my reading, I would say it probably is covered by the necessary and proper clause. It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 that says Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper to do all those good things that are spoken of in the preamble. So over time, we've developed these entities, along with others that were not called for in the Constitution, like a standing army, The Founding Fathers did not want standing armies. They didn't want a permanent national defense system. They did not want that. It is not in the Constitution. But it was decided to do that at some point because it was deemed necessary and proper to do so. Likewise with public education. It was decided over time, we need public education. It enhances the general welfare. It enhances our liberties. It enhances opportunity. It makes us safer, smarter, stronger. We share the expense and we share the benefits of fire departments, police departments, our military, the various branches of the military and the rest of the security apparatus. Definitely not all of which I am crazy about, as many of you probably aren't. But if someone attacks the United States, we have a security apparatus and a defense system to work against those attacks. Our state, county, city, police, and sheriff's departments and other law enforcement agencies, shared expense, shared benefit. The Social Security system, an insurance program that almost everyone pays into and almost everyone draws out of at some point. Medicare, Medicaid, the national parks, state parks, regional parks, city parks. You know, and I want to mention there's one city park that's very important to me. It's down at Oakland City Hall, the lawn in front of City Hall. These public places, like this plaza right here, the quad, right? The quad's important. It's a place where people can gather, a place where it's physically possible for a lot of people to come together. And following the occupation of Wall Street exactly 1 year ago today, September 17th, 2011 was the first day of the occupation of Wall Street. People standing up against corporate crime, people calling for a real democracy not tainted by corruption, mainly in the form of money that dominates our political system. That was an exciting day, and it's fitting that it happened on Constitution Day. And then shortly thereafter, a bunch of people in Oakland occupied the park in front of Oakland City Hall. And most people I know now call it some version of Ogawa Grant Plaza or straight up Oscar Grant Plaza. And that turned out to be a fabulous place for people to get together and decide how we are going to work to promote our general welfare. And I hope that work continues. And I know it's going to get fired back up downtown on October 10th, which is the anniversary of Occupy Oakland. Ah, it's hot out here. It's hot out here. So yeah, I wore my only clean t-shirt today. The term welfare has become a pejorative term when used by political activists to try to pit real working people's interests against other real working people's interests, to pit the working poor against the unemployed poor, to try to create divisions between any part of society that can be divided. It's a trick, and we're not going to fall for it. The general welfare is obviously a great good. In reality, in the United States, what most people think of as welfare, things like food stamps, direct cash assistance, most of that money, it's because of population figures, yes, but most of that money goes to white Americans outside of cities. Okay, but somehow, someone has painted a picture that has infected most of our minds to where even those of us who believe in welfare programs from time to time get sucked into thinking that welfare means poor people of color in cities who don't work on purpose and sponge off of the effort of people who do work. It is a tremendous mistake. If you look at a pie chart of where the federal government's money is spent, welfare is a pretty small part of that. It's about 12%. National defense is at least 24%, projected all the way up into the year 2017. All right? We pay into welfare. We pay into the Social Security system. We pay for workers' comp. That is not free money. That's my paycheck. That if I get hurt, some of the money comes back to me, but I earned it. Social Security, same thing. If I'm lucky enough to live long enough to retire, I'm going to get back some of the money that I put in. All right? And I'm good with that. I'll take that money. And I'm okay with my mom getting some of that money right now. And I hope some of you young folks will be happy to be paying into that system when I'm ready to take money out of that system. All right, welfare. I guess I want to leave us with this note. If we look at what these words mean, and I got to tell you, it's worth the time to sit down. It ain't that long even. You can read the Constitution in a couple of hours, maybe a couple little sessions like that. You can maybe skip that long section about who succeeds the president and the vice president. Might want to skip that part. But if you look at it, the goals are clear in the preamble. They are noble goals. Obviously, as Dr. Webb pointed out, the project of building a more perfect union was definitely not a done deal in 1787 when they signed the Constitution. But we can still make it. The guidelines are in the Constitution. Our political system needs repairs. No one's going to do it for us. We have to do it for ourselves, and we can. And so I hope you'll carry the word welfare around in your mind with connotations of togetherness, community, shared expense, and shared benefit. Togetherness, community, belonging together, having a reason to call ourselves a nation, having a reason to be proud of that flag, having some reason to be proud that you're part of this United States of America, this thing that didn't exist. And some people say it doesn't exist, that it's still a figment of our imagination. Well, I think we can make it more real every day. We can make it more real by our own efforts. And that idea of public shared expense and public shared benefits is the easy part and the win-win-win-win-win part of the whole project. We're in this life together because we live close to one another. If we can stay together and think together and challenge each other, we can keep making this union of the United States. We can maybe one day actually get it to the point where the language suggests it should be, that perfect union that they talked about all those years ago. I will look for you all downtown tomorrow night. There's a rally for justice for a young man named Alan Bluford who was killed at Skyline High School by a police officer. There are a lot of genuine questions in the air. They need to be addressed and answered. The rally's at 5:30 before the city council meeting at Ogawa Grant Plaza. And then I hope you'll look for activities around October 10th for the reoccupation. Occupy Oakland is going to be celebrating their anniversary, and they need some reforms too. I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Weidenbach. Leads perfectly into our next speaker. Professor Richard Kim is going to speak on This Unfinished Country.
Well, in case I forget, because I could forget, this is about voting as well, so don't forget. Very good, thank you. Don't forget to vote. Yes, vote, vote, vote. So the registration cards are still on the desk along with some very nice refreshments. So, and also Prop 30, take a close look at that and the language and see what you would like, whether you would like to strengthen education in California at the community college level, all the way up to the University of California. Did you see the Laney Eagle? I think I saw him. I think he wandered off the quad, but he was invited to come here. But where is he? Laney Eagle, are you here? All right, anyway. So the Constitutional Convention where the Constitution was signed in 225 years ago in 1787 was of course in Philadelphia, and that is also the home of the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Laney Eagle looks a lot like the Philadelphia Eagles mascot, except he's actually an eagle and that one's not. Okay. Now the title of this short talk, and I won't ask for equal time, is on the Constitution itself and the kind of document that the Constitution is, and also the kind of men that the founding fathers were. And one issue is this notion that the Constitution is almost a sacred document, and that the making of it and the making, therefore, of the United States was somehow inevitable. So, is the Constitution sacred? Well, you have a number of views, and it's yes and it's no. As a matter of law, it's not a sacred document. But many historians, particularly those historians, as I am a historian, particularly of the 1800s, that is the 19th century, when a lot of nations were actually created, and the United States got a firmer sense of its own national identity. These 19th century historians, they held to this belief that was still in the air in the late 18th century, that the Constitution is a product of divine providence, that is to say, it's God's will. And so if you just open your wallet and you take out a dollar bill, you'll see that it has this language, this notion of, in God we trust. So there is this idea that the Constitution of the United States is a matter of inevitability, it's a matter of destiny. Well, maybe it is, and maybe it's not. But one thing is for certain, as a historian, as a matter of history, believe it or not, history, our history, the history of every country, it's not generally on the side of constitutions. History, as one of the inventors or the philosophers of history, a German, they're all German unfortunately, is by the name of Hegel. He said that history is unkind. It's full of wars, it's full of bad things, and it is, at one point he describes it as a slaughter bench. That is to say, things tend to get sort of mangled in history. So constitutions have to take a lot of beating, they have to take a lot of punishment, and for a very long period of time, constitutions were not popular. They weren't considered to be credible, they weren't considered to be capable of providing good management or good government. So Professor Weidenbach, he has this little pocket constitution, as Oliver Wendell Holmes. He had the same constitution famously in his pocket, one of the Supreme Court justices. What basically is a constitution? And you're not going to read the Constitution. You can actually do that. It would take some time. But to get to it as quickly as possible, you want to describe what a constitutional democracy, not a monarchy, what a pure constitutional democracy is not. And that is, it's not a monarchy. But the real question is this. For those of you just wandering by, going to your classes, if this country was not a republic, or even more so, even more radically, if it were not a democracy, and it is, in fact, both things, though variously at different levels and at different times, if it was a monarchy, if this country was a monarchy ruled by, somebody with the last name of Bush, that came from a dynasty, or even a Clinton, and it was inherited by birth, would your life be any different in the broadest context? The people at large, the person in the white hat walking along the library, would it be very much different? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Would there be no economy? Would there be no job market? Would everybody be in dire straits? Well, maybe they would, but maybe they wouldn't. In the broadest sense, there's been a long period of time when people live not in democracies, and they lived under aristocrats, they lived under kings. So for hundreds, if not for over 1,000 years, people were governed under some kind of direct rule. That is, the people, you, I, the people at large, walking around the streets, the people in the streets had no connection, no access to political power. Other people did, a very few number of people did. They possessed the political power, and for the longest periods of time, of history, world history, they were the enfranchised, whereas the people at large, you and me, most people, the 99%, as Professor Weidenbach's t-shirt professes, they were the disenfranchised. So most people, the people basically were disenfranchised. They had laws, but they were excluded from political power. But did it matter? Well, yes and no. Mostly no. Why? Because most people, for the longest periods of time, didn't know. They didn't know, as the people walking on the street by the library, in and out of libraries, going to movies, seeing entertainment events, gladiatorial sports, whatever. They didn't know that they were politically powerless. They didn't have a clue. Why? Because they were illiterate. Now, what does being literate mean in the historical sense? That is, they couldn't read the Bible. That's right, the good book. And by reading the Bible, I don't mean reading it in German or reading it in French or reading it in English. That is, the Bible in Latin, right? So all the way up to about, let's say, the early part of the 20th century, to be literate meant that you had some sort of liberal education, you had some sort of classical education that would teach you to learn Latin, and you had these fancy schools such as Princeton and Harvard that required you not to take the SAT, but to take an exam in which you had to read somebody by the name of Cicero, who was an ancient Roman senator, famous for writing very long Latin sentences. So most people didn't read Latin. It was expensive to learn. You had to be in the church, and there were various degrees of literacy in the church as well. So most people didn't know that they were disempowered. So if you lived in a monarchy, if you lived in a tyranny, if you lived in some kind of autocracy, if you lived under the Tsar of Russia, most peasants, they knew vaguely, but they really didn't care. They just didn't care. So what is a democracy? A democracy, all modern democracies, beginning in the late 1700s, were radical experiments. As this experiment remains this constitutional experiment that vouchsafes democracy, is a radical experiment. Modern democracies began by a waking up to inequality, to waking up to political disenfranchisement on the part of the people at large. That is to say, genuinely, they began as revolutionary movements in America in 1776, in France in 1789, across the gulf of time, where in the distant past, in ancient Athens, they were regarded as ancient relics of the ancient past. The term monarchy itself, since we talked about that and whether it makes a difference whether you live in a monarchy or a democracy, a constitutional democracy, it comes from the ancient Greek, which means mono, one, archon. Archon was a ruler, a magistrate. There was more than one, so this just means one ruler or one judge. This notion of an archon or archons thrived alongside the notion of democracy in ancient Athens, which is supposedly the birthplace of democracy. But after the decline of democracy in ancient Athens, 5th century BC with the decline of Heraclean Athens, in the 4th century, democracy was not really taken seriously. And even in Greece, the land of the philosophers, you have one of the most eminent philosophers, Aristotle. He helped invent political science. He helped invent all these modern philosophy, along with his predecessor, Plato. And Aristotle was the famous teacher of Alexander the Great, who was not a Democrat. He was an empire maker, Alexander. And he had a disdain for democracies because he was taught that way. By his teacher, by Aristotle. Aristotle thought that democracies were inherently unstable, and they led to miserable failure, as exemplified in the Athenian democratic experiment. Aristotle, one of the fathers of modern Western thought base, and of also the Middle Ages, it's all Aristotle, basically said that democracies are a dumb idea because people in large groups are basically stupid. Plato, who disagreed, Aristotle's predecessor, disagreed with Aristotle on almost everything. They didn't get along philosophically. But in his most famous book, which is ironically named The Republic, Plato placed the ultimate power in an elitist group known as the Guardians. And these Guardians were nurtured in Spartan-like fashion to rule their country, to rule their polity. So he was espousing, as some Plato scholars note, a kind of anti-democratic republic, a sort of dictatorship of sorts. And this notion of elitism marks out ancient political thought. But back to this issue of democracies. This notion of a republic, and that's what the United States remains at this very moment, was in fact the choice of the founding fathers. And the question really is, why? Well, one is because they didn't entirely trust the people. They didn't trust the people at large entirely. But they did as well. They believed in democracy, but like Plato, like Aristotle, they also held their reservations. So they compromised, and that's also an American political tradition. They compromised for another old solution. It's the Roman solution. Rome before empire. Rome of the wise, old patrician men, the wealthy men. They're not quite Plato's guardians, but they had a very important institution in ancient Rome. It was known as the Senate. It was a group of, old, rich men. Sounds familiar. I think the Senate's still the same today. It's a republic. So in that representative institution that's guided by these wealthy old men, republics still are something of a radical experiment. And it wasn't entirely successful, famously, in Roman history. Rome was the premier example of governance for the classically literate. The founding fathers definitely looked at this. And when democracy was embraced in the Atlantic world, in the United States, in America, and in France, they chose democracy. But they realized that democracy is risky. Why? Because like anything that has risk, it's sort of like a gambit. It's a gamble. And it's a radical gamble. It's a bet. It's a bet on the people at large. It's a bet on the people being able to rule themselves. Now, as I said, to just sum these up, these two powerful, famous, most celebrated examples of the founding fathers, such as Hamilton and Madison, they read, all of them, Jefferson included. They saw Athens had become a tyranny. Athens, the model of ancient democracy, in its own political life, became a bullying regional imperial superpower, attempting to bludgeon its neighboring Greek city-states into submission. So much so that those that felt abused by Athens sought protection by another powerful military power. That was Sparta. So this city-state of Sparta famously went to war against this democracy of Athens. And the war didn't last 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, or 5 years. It lasted 20 years, 2 decades. And this democracy, Athens, lost. And that was the way of democracy in the ancient world. And also, to put the cherry on top of this, they executed Plato's teacher Socrates famously, so not so enlightened, these Athenians. In Rome, as I mentioned, the Senate was the basic institution, these old men, rich old men, institution of republican politics. But the Senate met with its final crisis in the rise of a military dictatorship, a strongman, a would-be strongman. His name was Julius Caesar, who they felt correctly, the senators, would destabilize Roman government and bring the Roman Republic to an end. Caesar was famously assassinated, and this gave rise to the Roman Civil War and the end of democratic republican politics in Rome. And the man who rose to power to claim this imperial, anti-senatorial, anti-republican mantle was a fellow by the name of Octavian, and he renamed himself Caesar Augustus, and the name Augustus would live on through the centuries as being synonymous with the emperor. So the history of the Roman Republic is not such a happy example. So we flash forward to the final part here. That's over hundreds of years, over 1,000 years. We have these American revolutionaries. They wage a war against monarchy. But some of them actually think that maybe monarchy isn't such a bad idea. After all, the British, they have their cake and they've eaten it too. They have a constitutional monarchy, yes? So maybe we can still have a king. Maybe it should be George Washington, right? But so they're not sure. They've read about these ancient attempts at republics and democracies. What is best, they think. So they create some laws. They've created some laws before for the newly independent American states after the War of Independence with this despotic evil monarchy, and they call it the Articles of Confederation. These do not work. They fail. This attempt at union fails. So they try a second time. They gather in Philadelphia, and they try it again. They have a constitutional convention, and they do it again. They double down on the same bet. And it's the bet that had failed in the past, but they bet on the people. They bet on the American people. They bet on you. They bet on me, everyone that becomes an American citizen, everyone on the street. Because constitutions, any modern constitution rests on one basic principle, however controversial, of the 18th century Enlightenment, the modern project. The people, you, the guy walking along with the backpack over there, the trash can, that person can take care of his own business, the people's business. The laws, in Latin, res publica, public matters, matters of law. But the public is the key term. It's my business, it's your business, it's this business of all citizens, and that is radical. But if it is your business, it is also your responsibility. And trust me, even though how I began regarding the voter registration and thinking about Prop 30, it goes beyond voting. In fact, voting is the least of your problems. Because as some of the founding fathers, or at least one, Thomas Paine comes to mind, Thomas Paine thought that the American people should be in a state of full engagement all the time, revolutionary citizens entrusted to govern themselves. There are also passive ones, and there was a designation during the French Revolution, but it was this notion of active citizenship. In a celebrated anecdote, Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention came out of the deliberations, and he was met by an ordinary woman by the name of Mrs. Powell, and she asked Franklin, well, what do we have? Do we have a monarchy or do we have a republic? And Franklin famously replied, a republic, if you can keep it. The sad fact of the matter, however, is the United States didn't keep it. There was a terrible civil war that required a rewriting of the Constitution. Every amendment to the US Constitution changes the fundamental characters of the laws of the United States. And so this gamble, which is the gamble that still made the gambit, is a life and death political gamble. It's the life and death of republics, which is not the responsibility of your government, of your legislature. It's actually your responsibility. It's a gamble by the founding fathers on down through each generation upon which this trust is passed. It's a gamble on you, the people. It's your responsibility, it's my responsibility to prove Plato, Aristotle, and the classical political theorists wrong. That republics, democracies work. The Constitution would not be sacred, and it is, in fact, if the people and the idea of popular sovereignty was not sacred within the very idea of a constitution. The Constitution would be a meaningless piece of paper, or pieces of papers, if this internally pregnant principle, which makes it a living document, a living thing, and not, as Thurgood Marshall believed, a static thing that is fixed in the past, that's fixed with the intentions of what the founding fathers thought the United States should be. Every generation has its own constitution, and the Constitution grows with the people, it changes with the people, and res publica, public matters, the law rests with the people forever. The people can rule themselves. It's only an unfinished political project with an infinite horizon and without an end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Professor Kim will be speaking at 1 o'clock in E201B if you'd like to discuss further with him the idea of this unfinished country. The Eagle. Okay, go Eagle. All right. Our final speaker today is Professor A.B. Wilkinson. He will be speaking on a history of U.S. voter suppression and why your vote counts today.
Hello, hello. Today I'll be giving a little short history of U.S. voter suppression in the U.S. And why your vote is important. Basically, I'm going to be presenting the argument that the U.S. has always been into suppressing people's votes. What's that? Closer? Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm kind of new at this. Okay. So the U.S. has had a long history of voter suppression and really not an extension of the democratic right of voting for over our 200-year history in these United States. Of course, many of you know that it starts with African Americans, and many of you have heard of the 3/5 Amendment, which I'm going to break down a little bit, but many people believe that African Americans shouldn't have been counted for any percentage towards the voting of these United States, because that 3/5 clause in the Constitution is really not about humanity or citizenship, but representation in the House of Representatives. Frederick Douglass, the famous, even closer, okay. Frederick Douglass, the famous slave who once stole himself, as he said, from his master in Maryland and went on to become a great abolitionist speaker and U.S. politician, said that he would have had African Americans counted at 0/5 because it actually gave the South more power in the House of Representatives, which in the election of 1800 allowed Thomas Jefferson to win election into the White House as a slaveholder. But I'm going to start off here with just a quote of Douglass on reform. Douglass, that slave that said he had stolen his own limbs, his own body, to search for freedom. He said, quote, "Let me give you a word of philosophy on reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress." And I've often said this to my students, so I'll repeat it again. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. And this election coming up is going to be about struggle. It will definitely be about struggle. Douglass continues, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power," Douglass says, "concedes nothing without a demand. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress," Douglass said. Well, we don't have to go about blows, and we don't have to go about just words either, because we do have the vote. And hopefully, if I can hear people out there that are registered to vote, let me hear you. Clap if I can hear you if you're registered to vote. Another thing Douglass said, quote, "Men may not get all they pay for in this world, but they must certainly pay for all they get. If we ever get free from the oppressions and wrongs heaped upon us, we must pay for their removal. We must do this by labor, by suffering, by sacrifice, and if needs be, by our lives and the lives of others." Well, today in E273, I'm going to be giving a little presentation with overhead, audio visuals, video, that talks a little bit about that oppression and about that struggle that many of our ancestors had to go through to get us that ballot, to get us that vote. And not only African Americans, but poor European Americans, or poor whites, as they were often referred to in the South, were deprived of the vote for many years because they didn't own land or property. Women are another group who have been historically kept from the ballot, as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were just a couple of the women of our foremothers who struggled for decades to get all women the vote. And some of these issues were intertwined, as I'll be talking about today, as African Americans and women's both struggled for the franchise during the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Susan B. Anthony, when she was only 16 years old, and she wouldn't even get the vote when she turned 18, but at 16 years old, Susan B. Anthony went door to door in her neighborhood to get petitions signed against slavery for the anti-slavery associations during her time. And so many of these historically oppressed groups have often worked together to further each other's cause. Mexican Americans are another group who have been historically denied the ballot. They've always been here. In fact, we're here in Mexico today, if you count before 1848 in the Mexican cession. But braceros came during the 1930s and 1940s into the 1950s and 60s. They were denied the ballot. And many of us descend from these working class peoples today. Chinese and Japanese Americans also excluded, not only from the vote, but also from citizenship, with the first discriminatory immigration acts being passed in the U.S. in the 1880s and 1890s. It wasn't until 1943 that Chinese Americans could become citizens and cast their ballots. Filipinos, 1946. And Japanese Americans, 1952. People, this is within our recent history. Many of our parents and grandparents did not have the right to do what we'll all be able to do on November 6th, and that's to cast the ballot. The first Americans, indigenous peoples, were not allowed to cast votes in this country until 1924, unless they had assimilated to Anglo-American culture. Many were still kept from voting until the 1950s and 1960s. And this is when we know about the civil rights movement reaching its peak, where African Americans, Chicanos, women sought not just to mimic mainstream upper class elite America, but to change it, to become a part and make the U.S. a part of their unique cultures. Now, this discrimination has continued on to today. I don't know if many people are aware, but voter suppression is something that's still taking place. As large groups of people are being kept from casting their ballots. We all know about 2000 and what happened in Florida with the hung Chads, or the Chads that they couldn't count, votes they couldn't go back and count. 2004, voting irregularities throughout Ohio. And then 2008, where President Obama was historically elected into office. Well, I'll tell you, voter suppression is real, and it's been happening in several states, or is going to happen in several states across this nation on November 6th. Since 2010, many states have already been passing laws that restrict voting, and reduce the voting hours that are allowed, reducing the days they can vote, and early voting, and making people produce IDs that weren't required before, which some lower class peoples can't afford. So 2012 is going to be another historical event for all of us, whether we're there or not.
Well, that concludes our presentation for this first day of Laney College's Constitution Days.